The lighthouse had always been the town's silent guardian. Rising above jagged cliffs, its light cut through storms, a promise that sailors would find their way home. For generations, the villagers trusted it. Every evening, when the beam swept across the horizon, it meant safety. And every evening, one man carried the weight of keeping that promise: Richard Halden. Richard was not famous, not the kind of man who stood out in a crowd. But people knew him. He was steady, polite, someone who always nodded in greeting when he came down into the village for supplies. He bought the same things: coffee, bread, kerosene, canned meat, and carried them up the lonely path to the tower. To many, he was simply the keeper, a man who lived in the lighthouse and made sure the light never failed. Born to a family of fishermen, Richard knew the sea better than most. His father had been taken by a storm when Richard was only 12, a loss that shaped him into someone who respected the ocean's power. While others sought excitement, Richard sought stability. The lighthouse gave him both solitude and purpose. It became his world. Life in the tower was simple but demanding. Each morning, he climbed the spiral stairs to check the lantern. He logged the weather, trimmed the wick, polished the glass. At night, he lit the flame, sending its beam far across the waves. He ate modest meals, wrote occasional letters to relatives, and sometimes sat on the balcony listening to the sea. The routine was repetitive, but it was never meaningless. Every ship that passed relied on him, though most never knew his name. The villagers respected his commitment, though they sensed the toll it took. Some said he looked more tired with each year. Others noticed the way he lingered in town just a little longer before walking back to the cliffs. Still, no one imagined he would ever abandon the light. In their eyes, Richard was as much a part of the lighthouse as the stone itself. June 14, 1972, was the last day anyone saw him alive. Clouds rolled in early that morning, heavy and dark, the sea restless even before the storm broke. A shopkeeper remembered selling him bread and coffee. Another villager recalled watching him climb the path, shoulders hunched against the wind, carrying a sack of supplies. By late afternoon, the storm was rising, and the tower disappeared into sheets of rain. That night, something happened that had never happened before. The light went out. Fishermen returning from offshore waters reported complete darkness on the cliffs. The familiar beam, their nightly guide, was missing. They navigated by memory, some barely avoiding the rocks. Back in the village, families gathered by windows, watching the black horizon. Fear spread quickly. If the light was gone, something was wrong. By morning, the storm still raged, and the lighthouse remained dark. Authorities were called. Deputies, joined by villagers, climbed the slippery path to the tower. The wind howled, the sea roared, and the stone walls groaned under the force of the waves. Inside, they found silence. Richard's quarters looked untouched. His bed was made, his boots neatly placed by the door. His jacket hung from a hook, dry and ready. On the desk sat his logbook, the final entry written in his precise hand. Winds increasing. Visibility near zero. The sentence trailed off, unfinished. In the stove was a kettle of water gone cold, but Richard was nowhere to be found. The storm outside battered the walls as searchers combed the rooms. They shouted his name, their voices swallowed by wind and stone. They checked the cellar, the storage rooms, the narrow stairwells. The tower offered no answers. It was as though the man had vanished between one heartbeat and the next. Down in the village, word spread like fire. Crowds gathered near the harbor, some praying, others whispering. Margaret, Richard's sister, arrived within hours, her face pale with disbelief. She stood at the base of the tower staring upward. He wouldn't have left the light, she repeated again and again. Not in a storm. Not when people depended on him. Her words cut through the chaos, planting doubt in everyone's mind. If Richard hadn't left willingly, then where was he? The storm was still fierce, but the search began immediately. Deputies secured ropes and lanterns. Boats circled the cliffs despite the waves. Helicopters scanned the water. On land, villagers scrambled over the rocks, eyes searching for any trace. A coat, a boot, anything. Nothing appeared. The sea, as always, gave nothing back. Inside the tower, one detail went overlooked. The lantern room at the very top remained sealed. Its hatch was rusted shut, the glass coated in salt and grime. From below, it looked empty. In the rush of the storm, no one forced it open. The deputies marked it secured and moved on. Their attention stayed on the ocean, convinced that was where the truth lay. By the end of that day, the lighthouse had shifted from symbol of safety to source of fear. The light was gone, the keeper was gone, and the storm had erased every clue. What remained was only silence, and the certainty that something had happened on that cliff no one could yet explain. The search for Richard Holden began before the storm had even fully broken. Deputies, fishermen, and villagers tied ropes around their waists and ventured onto the cliffs, their lanterns flickering against the sheets of rain. The sea was violent, waves exploding into white spray that reached halfway up the tower. Voices shouted his name again and again, swallowed by the roar of the wind. They searched every ledge, every cove, every slick path that he might have taken. But the cliffs gave them nothing. At the harbor, boats pushed into the raging water, their crews straining against the current. The men who went out that night knew the risks. The sea was unpredictable, and a single mistake could cost them their lives. Still, they searched. The light of the lighthouse, the very signal that should have guided them, was gone. In its place was only blackness and the uneasy knowledge that the man who kept it burning was missing. For Margaret Holden, the hours dragged like years. She arrived in the village soaked and pale, clutching her brother's letters as if they could shield her from the truth. He was steady, she told the sheriff. He would not walk away. He would not abandon his post. Her words carried more than hope. They carried defiance. She refused to believe the sea had taken him without a trace. Villagers who heard her felt the same unease. If Richard was gone, why had the ocean left no sign behind? Over the next 2 days, the search widened. Helicopters from the Coast Guard circled overhead, their spotlights cutting across the gray waves. Divers entered the freezing water in sheltered coves, surfacing with nothing but seaweed. Volunteers combed the shoreline for miles in both directions. Each hour ended the same way, with empty hands and heavy silence. Inside the tower, the investigators returned. They checked his quarters once more, hoping for overlooked evidence. The kettle was still on the stove. His boots still stood by the door. The logbook still trailed off mid-sentence. It felt as if Richard had simply stepped out of the room and vanished. The sheriff noted in his report, no signs of disturbance, no indication of voluntary departure. But if he had not left by choice, then what had happened? Margaret pressed them to open the lantern room at the top, insisting her brother might have gone there during the storm. But the deputies hesitated. The hatch was rusted shut, the glass nearly opaque. Through the grime, nothing could be seen. They marked it secured, convinced it was empty, and returned their attention to the cliffs. That decision, born of urgency and assumption, would haunt the case for decades. As the days stretched on, the family's hope began to fray. Each evening, Margaret stood by the harbor, waiting for word from the search boats. Each morning, she walked the cliffs with volunteers, scanning the rocks until her legs gave out. It was as though the sea swallowed him whole, one villager remembered her saying. But even the sea leaves traces. Her disbelief mirrored the growing suspicion in town. that something about the disappearance did not fit. Rumors began to spread. Some suggested Richard had fallen victim to sudden illness, perhaps collapsing in a place the storm quickly concealed. Others whispered that he had chosen to leave, abandoning the solitary life he had carried for years. But those who knew him dismissed that theory. He would never walk away, Margaret insisted. Not from the light, not from us. The sheriff's office tried to balance compassion with reality. Resources were strained. The storm had destroyed boats, damaged homes, and demanded attention across the county. After the third day, officials began to withdraw support. The Coast Guard reduced its presence. Deputies shifted focus to recovery rather than rescue. The official explanation solidified. Richard Halden had been lost at sea during the storm, but the villagers were not convinced. "The sea gives something back," one fisherman said. "A plank, a coat, a rope. Something. But this time, nothing." For them, the silence was louder than the storm had been. The absence of evidence felt unnatural. The fact that the lantern room had never been opened only deepened their unease. Margaret refused to let the matter end. She petitioned the sheriff, wrote letters to state officials, begged for another round of searches. But as weeks passed and no answers appeared, her pleas were met with tired sympathy. Officials told her gently that there was nothing more to be done. The case would be filed as an accident. Richard's name would be listed alongside those the sea had claimed. For the family, it was not closure. It was abandonment. Margaret clung to his belongings: a pocket knife, a cap, and his last unfinished letter. Each anniversary, she returned to the lighthouse with flowers, placing them at the base while the waves thundered below. Villagers sometimes joined her in silence, their presence both comfort and protest. They too felt the story had ended too quickly, that something vital had been missed. And so, within weeks of the storm, the official search for Richard Halden ended. But in the minds of those closest to him, questions remained. Why had the sea left no trace? Why had the lantern gone dark on the very night he disappeared? And why had the place where he worked, the highest chamber of the tower, remained unopened? Without answers, suspicion took root. And suspicion, once planted, does not die easily. For weeks after the search was called off, Richard Halden's disappearance remained the central topic in the village. People gathered in the harbor tavern, repeating the same questions that had no answers. How could a man vanish from a tower so confined, so contained, without leaving a trace? Theories multiplied, but none resolved the unease. The sheriff's office continued to collect statements. Fishermen who had been at sea that night recalled the storm, but nothing unusual. Villagers who had last seen Richard confirmed only that he was carrying supplies up the path. The shopkeeper remembered his purchase of bread and coffee. Margaret gave her testimony, her voice breaking as she insisted her brother would never abandon his post. None of it offered clarity. Investigators explored the idea of voluntary disappearance. Did Richard walk away? Did he tire of solitude and decide to leave? The problem was evidence. His belongings remained untouched. His pay was uncollected. His letters showed no sign of planning. Everything pointed to continuity, not escape. Another theory suggested misadventure inside the tower. Perhaps he had fallen in a hidden shaft or been trapped in machinery. But multiple searches of the lower levels revealed nothing. The lantern room, still rusted shut, remained unchecked, recorded only as secured. Officials dismissed it as irrelevant. Their focus was elsewhere, on the sea, the cliffs, and the endless horizon that seemed capable of swallowing a man whole. As weeks turned to months, outside interest waned. Newspapers that once ran daily updates relegated the story to brief mentions. Headlines shifted to new storms, new crises. By the end of 1972, Richard Halden's disappearance was already sliding into memory. Margaret refused to let it go. She wrote letters to state authorities demanding intervention. For a short time, additional investigators were dispatched. They reviewed the original reports, noted inconsistencies, and criticized the speed with which the case had been closed. But without new evidence, even their efforts faded. They could not justify devoting more resources to a mystery with no leads. By the mid-1970s, the file was formally archived. Inside it were copies of interviews, weather reports, and a brief final statement. Presumed lost at sea during storm conditions. That line became the official truth. In reality, it was an assumption written down to close a case no one knew how to solve. The lighthouse itself reinforced that silence. Automation had arrived. By 1978, there was no longer a need for a keeper. The tower was sealed, its rooms locked, and visits reduced to technical inspections. Engineers came occasionally, but only to service machinery. Few ever climbed the full staircase. The lantern room, its glass clouded and its hatch sealed, remained untouched. With the passing years, memory hardened into folklore. Children whispered about the keeper who had vanished. Teenagers dared each other to approach the tower at night, convinced they might glimpse a shadow behind the glass. Some locals claimed they avoided the cliffs altogether, unsettled by the idea of an unfinished story looming over them. For older villagers, the tale grew simple. The sea had taken Richard Halden, just as it had taken so many others. Yet doubts lingered. Fishermen remarked that storms rarely left nothing. Usually there were fragments, wreckage, clothing, a trace of struggle. But here, there was only absence. Margaret clung to that point in every interview she gave. The sea always returns something. This time, it returned nothing. Still, time moved on. Families grew, generations shifted, and the mystery receded into the background of local history. In the 1980s and 1990s, the case was mentioned only when tourists asked why the lighthouse was no longer staffed. Locals would say simply, "The keeper was lost in a storm." Few went into detail. Inside the sheriff's office, the story was remembered only as a cautionary tale. New deputies were told of the case during training, warned about the mistakes of hasty assumptions. Privately, some admitted that the failure to open the lantern room was the investigation's greatest oversight. But those admissions stayed internal. Officially, the report remained unchanged. By the turn of the millennium, the Holden case was nearly forgotten. Margaret, older now, still placed flowers at the base of the tower every June. Some villagers joined her, their presence less about hope and more about respect. They no longer expected answers, only silence. The lighthouse, weathered and dark, stood as both monument and reminder. And then, in 2010, silence was broken. Workers sent to restore the structure climbed the same spiral staircase that deputies had climbed nearly 40 years earlier. This time, they forced open the hatch no one else had touched. What they found inside would shock everyone who believed the mystery had been buried forever. For nearly 4 decades, the lighthouse stood locked and forgotten. Its lantern was automated, its rooms sealed, and its windows crusted with salt and grime. From the village, the dome at the top looked opaque, as if it held nothing but dust and rust. Tourists who walked the cliff sometimes stopped to photograph it, but few ever ventured inside. For the townspeople, the tower was no longer a place of safety. It was a reminder of a mystery that had never been solved. By 2010, interest in the old structure returned. Local officials, eager to preserve history and attract visitors, approved a restoration project. Contractors were hired to stabilize the walls, replace corroded iron, and clean the lantern glass. To the workers, it was just another job. To the villagers, it was an opportunity to see the tower reborn. No one imagined it would reopen a case buried for almost 40 years. On July 12th, a crew arrived at the base of the cliffs. The air smelled of salt and rust. gulls circling overhead as they unloaded their equipment. The path leading upward was overgrown, the stones cracked and slippery. Inside, the tower was worse. Dust blanketed the staircase, cobwebs stretched across corners, and the silence was oppressive. Each step echoed like an intrusion into a place that had been left untouched for too long. The men climbed higher, their boots clanging against the metal steps. Some joked nervously to break the tension, but the laughter faded quickly. The air grew heavier the higher they went, stale with age. One worker later said it felt as if the tower itself was holding its breath. At last, they reached the hatch to the lantern room. Rust had sealed it shut, and the padlock was corroded solid. It took minutes of hammering and prying before the metal gave way. The hatch creaked open with a sound that echoed down the staircase. A rush of stagnant air spilled out, dry and lifeless. Inside, the lantern room was dim. The great lens, once polished and gleaming, was coated with grime. The glass walls were clouded, streaked with years of salt and rain. Dust swirled in the weak light. For a moment it seemed like nothing more than an abandoned chamber. Then, in the far corner, they saw it. A figure, seated, facing outward toward the horizon. At first, the workers thought it was a mannequin, some forgotten prop left behind when the tower was automated. But as they drew closer, their nerves tightened. The clothing was real, the boots were worn, the posture was unmistakably human. The room fell silent as realization struck. What they had found was not a mannequin. It was the missing lighthouse keeper. The crew stumbled back, shaken. Calls were made immediately, voices trembling as they reported the discovery. Within hours, police and forensic specialists were on site. The spiral staircase, untouched for decades, now carried investigators retracing steps that searchers had once taken in 1972. Only this time, there was no denying what was inside. News spread quickly. By the next morning, newspapers carried the headline, "Lighthouse Keeper, found after 38 years." Reporters flooded the village, cameras aimed at the cliffs. Locals who had lived through the storm of 1972 found themselves reliving memories they had long tried to bury. Some admitted to anger at the failures of the original search. Others could not believe they had lived under the shadow of the tower without knowing the truth. The details stunned everyone. Richard Halden had been inside the lantern room the entire time. The very place marked secured in the original reports had concealed him just meters above the heads of those who searched. For decades, villagers had walked the beach. Teenagers had dared each other to climb the cliffs. Tourists had snapped photographs, all with the missing man sealed behind the glass above them. Experts explained how it was possible. The lantern room was almost airtight. The thick glass and sealed hatch created a dry environment. Heat from the sun turned the chamber into an oven, halting the process of decay. The lack of airflow meant no smell escaped. From the outside, the grime-covered windows prevented anyone from seeing inside. What seemed impossible was, in fact, tragically simple. The perfect conditions for a mystery to remain hidden in plain sight. For the family, the discovery reopened wounds that had never healed. Margaret, now elderly, wept when she received the confirmation. "I told them," she said quietly to reporters. "I told them he would not leave. He stayed with the light." Her words carried both vindication and sorrow. The truth had been found, but it was no comfort. In the village, shock turned to unease. Some residents avoided the lighthouse altogether, unsettled by the knowledge of what it had contained. Others went to stand at its base, staring upward in silence. The tower, once a beacon, was now a monument to oversight and unanswered questions. What began as a routine restoration had become one of the most startling discoveries in the region's history. But while the finding confirmed where Richard had been all along, it left a deeper question. What had happened in those final moments, and why had no one thought to look? The discovery in 2010 forced officials to confront what had been left unresolved for nearly 4 decades. Forensic teams entered the lantern room with care, documenting every angle before removing anything. Photographs captured the chamber as it was found. The rusted hatch, the grime-coated glass, the great lens standing in silence, and the figure seated in the corner as if still keeping watch. The remains were transported to a regional lab for analysis. Identification began with clothing and items recovered from the scene. The heavy boots, the wool coat, and the logbook page left unfinished all matched the era of the early 1970s. Technicians confirmed that these were consistent with Richard Halden's last recorded possessions. But science was needed for certainty. DNA was compared against samples from relatives. Weeks later, the results came back. A definitive match. The official statement was simple. The missing lighthouse keeper had been found. For the family, it was both confirmation and devastation. Margaret, now frail and in her 70s, attended a private briefing. She listened as officials explained the process, their words clinical and precise. When they finished, she said only, "I knew he never left." It was a vindication she had waited nearly 40 years to hear, but it offered no comfort. Closure without answers is not closure at all. Investigators attempted to reconstruct what might have happened in June 1972. One theory suggested that Richard had climbed into the lantern chamber during the storm to secure equipment. The hatch could have slammed shut behind him, locking him inside. With rust and pressure sealing it further, escape would have been impossible. Alone, cut off by the storm, he might have collapsed within hours. Another theory focused on health. Records showed Richard had reported chest pains in the months prior. If he suffered a sudden medical event while performing his duties, he would have been unable to call for help. The storm's noise would have drowned out any cries, and by the time searchers arrived, the hatch, already difficult to open, was overlooked in haste. A third possibility was the simplest and most unsettling: oversight. Deputies in 1972 had logged the lantern room as secured without forcing the hatch. Their assumption that it was empty became fact on paper, even though it had never been verified. That single decision allowed Richard to remain hidden for 38 years, just meters away from those who searched for him. Experts who reviewed the case in 2010 acknowledged that no theory could be proven. The environment inside the lantern explained how the body had remained intact: thick glass, sealed air, dry heat. But it did not explain the human element, why no one had opened the hatch, why reports were filed so quickly, why doubt was dismissed. The village reacted with a mixture of shock, anger, and sorrow. Some felt betrayed, convinced the authorities of 1972 had failed their duty. Others spoke of the haunting symbolism, that Richard had never abandoned the light, that he had kept his post until the very end. Fishermen remarked that in a way, he had continued his watch far longer than anyone realized. Margaret attended a memorial service organized after the confirmation. Villagers gathered at the base of the lighthouse, laying flowers while the waves struck the rocks below. She stood quietly, holding one of Richard's old letters, her eyes fixed on the lantern above. Reporters asked if she finally had peace. She answered, "Peace is knowing why. We don't know why." The lighthouse was eventually restored and reopened to visitors, but its story was never the same. Tourists climbed the spiral staircase, stopping near the hatch that had been sealed for decades. Guides explained the history carefully, speaking of the storm, the disappearance, and the discovery. Visitors often paused, staring at the glass dome, trying to imagine how a man could sit there for nearly 40 years, unseen. The case of Richard Halden closed officially in 2010 with the confirmation of identity. Unofficially, it remained open in the minds of those who knew the story. Theories continued to circulate, each carrying fragments of truth, none carrying certainty. Today, the beam of the restored lighthouse still sweeps across the sea. To many, it is only light. But to those who remember, it carries a shadow. The memory of a man who vanished, was searched for, and was never truly gone. Richard Halden disappeared in 1972. 38 years later, he was found exactly where he had always been, at the top of the lighthouse, behind the glass, keeping silent watch over the waves.